In 1494, an 11-year-old boy named Babur inherited an impossible expectation. Through his parents, he carried the bloodlines of both Timur and Genghis Khan. To the world of the 15th century steppe, he was a child born to rule everything. But the reality of his youth was a total collapse of that pedigree. He became a destitute refugee, wandering the mountains of Central Asia after losing his home in the Fergana Valley. He managed to capture the legendary city of Samarkand twice, but he lacked the resources to hold it, losing his throne and his capital before he was 20. In his personal memoirs, the Baburnama, Babur describes this period not as a glorious struggle, but as a time of deep humiliation. He wrote that he was a king without a kingdom, forced to seek refuge among hill tribes and peasants just to survive the winter. Even his personality seemed at odds with the typical image of a Turco-Mongol warlord. He was, in fact, an introspective scholar who wrote about his own bashfulness, recording how he was too shy to even look his first wife in the face, and recounting his quiet, awkward infatuation with a boy in his camp named Baburi. By 1504, Babur realized that his ancestral lands were permanently lost to the Uzbeks. He made a definitive geographic break, crossing the snowy Hindu Kush mountains to seize Kabul. It was here that he stopped looking back at Central Asia and turned his attention toward the wealth of India. This was his first major evolution. To avoid total erasure, Babur had to accept that his royal bloodline was no longer enough to sustain him. He had to be willing to abandon his home and his identity as a prince of the steppe to seek a future in a land he did not yet understand. In 1526, Babur finally stood at the gates of the Delhi Sultanate. At the First Battle of Panipat, he was outnumbered 10-1. He faced 100,000 soldiers and a terrifying front line of 1,000 war elephants. His ancestors would have met this force with a traditional cavalry charge, but Babur knew that horses could not break a line of armored elephants. To win, he would have to abandon the very military traditions that had defined his family for generations. His solution integrated modern gunpowder. Babur secured his center with Ottoman matchlocks and cast cannons. He used mobile cavalry for the tulugma, a flanking maneuver encircling the enemy. The roaring cannons won the day, panicking the elephants to trample their own infantry. Panipat proved that Babur's success wasn't born from brute strength. He conquered India by hybridizing the mobile tactics of his ancestors with the cutting-edge technology of the Ottoman Empire. The conquest was often brutal. To secure his rule, Babur oversaw the massive casualties of the battles of Kanwa and Chanderi, where his opponents chose collective suicide over surrender. Yet, even in the middle of these campaigns, Babur maintained a second, highly refined life. Within his war camps, he meticulously planned symmetrical Persian-style gardens, ordering the exact placement of fruit trees and running water. He hosted intellectual wine parties, wrote scholarly treatises on poetics, and documented the local biology. For Babur, these gardens were more than a hobby. They provided a necessary psychological balance. Cultivating this sense of absolute, beautiful order in his private life allowed him to endure the visceral carnage required to build an empire. When Babur first entered India, he acted as a rigid sectarian. He viewed himself as a Sunni warrior king, and his camps frequently built gruesome towers made from the skulls he defeated. This early rigidity extended to the local culture as well. When he encountered these massive Jain statues carved into the cliffs of Gwalior, he viewed them only as idols and immediately ordered his men to destroy them. But as he spent more time in the subcontinent, his philosophy began to shift. He realized that a minority ruling class could not sustain its power through destruction alone. To govern India, he would have to move toward a policy of humanism and religious tolerance. The ultimate proof of this change is found in his secret will, written in 1529 for his son and successor, Humayun. The document contains shocking advice for the time. Babur instructed his son to ignore the divide between Shias and Sunnis, to protect the temples and shrines of all communities, and to specifically avoid the sacrifice of cows out of respect for local traditions. Babur died in 1530 at the age of 47. In his brief 4-year reign, he had moved from being a displaced prince of the steppe to the architect of a new kind of empire, one that blended Timurid art and Persian culture with Indian pluralism. Babur is remembered as the founder of the Mughal Empire, but his true legacy was the administrative blueprint he left behind. By evolving his worldview to fit his new environment, he established the foundations for a dynasty that would rule India for 3 centuries. To understand how the Mughal Empire began, you have to start in the freezing, unforgiving mountains of Central Asia. This is where a teenage boy named Babur found himself as a refugee. He carried a terrifying genetic legacy, descended directly from both Genghis Khan and Timur. But bloodlines don't buy food. At this moment, he possessed exactly 0 wealth, 0 soldiers, and 0 territory. His life had collapsed with brutal speed. Babur inherited the throne of Fergana at age 11. Shortly after, he managed to capture his lifelong obsession, the Great Silk Road city of Samarkand. Within months, rival warlords drove him out, leaving him entirely landless. He spent years wandering the highlands, begging for shelter from local hill tribes. During this agonizing period of starvation and physical exhaustion, his only enduring possession was a book of poetry written in his native Chagatai. Gaining confidence, that decade of crushing defeat stripped away his royal illusions. Babur realized that holding on to his ancestors' entitlement would get him killed. To survive in this era, he had to completely reinvent the mechanics of conquest. In 1504, he crossed the snowy passes of the Hindu Kush and captured Kabul. He finally had a secure sanctuary. Inside Kabul, he built a vibrant intellectual laboratory. He spent his days studying local biology, cultivating poetry, and documenting his failures in a remarkably honest autobiography known as the Baburnama. But he faced a strategic dead end. The heavily armed Uzbek forces to the north were simply too strong, making a return to his ancestral homeland impossible. So Babur looked south toward India, and instead of relying on the traditional steppe cavalry of his ancestors, he hired Ottoman commanders to bring him a terrifying new technology. This schematic breaks down the mechanics of the Ottoman matchlock and field cannon. Traditional mounted archery required immense physical strength and muscle memory. Gunpowder weapons delivered reliable, armor-piercing kinetic energy that could shatter dense enemy lines from a distance, independent of physical fatigue. By abandoning the traditional warfare of the steppe and importing foreign artillery, Babur decoupled his strategy from his history. This intellectual leap gave him a mechanical advantage his enemies could not anticipate. In April 1526, Babur marched onto the plains of Panipat to face Ibrahim Lodi, the Sultan of Delhi. This chart illustrates Babur's terrifying disadvantage: 12,000 men against the Sultan's 100,000 soldiers and 1,000 war elephants. Babur countered with the Tulugma formation. His cavalry swept around the edges, trapping the Sultan's massive army in a tightly packed mass. With the enemy pinned, he ignited his field artillery. The deafening roar of cannons and concussive impact of iron balls panicked the massive elephants. Terrified by the smoke and noise, the animals turned and trampled their own infantry lines. A year later, at the Battle of Kanwa, Babur faced a massive coalition of Rajput warriors. He deployed the exact same combination of defensive positioning and coordinated gunpowder volleys, breaking their charge with cold precision. These victories proved his system was highly replicable. Massive, static armies relying on sheer manpower could now be systematically dismantled by geometry and chemistry. Conquering the subcontinent was a military calculation. Governing it from his new capital in Agra required entirely different tools. Early in his career, Babur acted as a militant conqueror, noting the slaughter of his enemies. But as he aged and consolidated control over a vast, diverse population, his religious and political policies shifted toward profound pragmatism. In a secret will, he instructed his son, Humayun, to govern with justice across all faiths. He explicitly advised him to protect Hindu temples, ban the slaughter of cows, and mediate the sectarian divides between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Personally, he never fully adjusted to the heat and dust of India. To cope with a lingering homesickness, he designed highly structured Persian gardens, mapping out flowing water channels and precise symmetry. He approached the management of his empire exactly like the soil. He saw his role as taking a chaotic, overgrown environment and carefully cultivating a space where disparate elements could coexist in order and beauty. Babur died in Agra in 1530, a mere 4 years after his triumph at Panipat. Years later, his family honored his final request. They returned his remains to the cool, terraced hillside of his favorite garden in Kabul. He left behind a military apparatus capable of dominating a continent, fused tightly with a deep appreciation for poetry, science, and the natural world. That exact combination became the operational DNA for his descendants. Over the next 2 centuries, the Mughal Empire would take that synthesis of strict geometry and artistic obsession to its absolute limits. The most culturally magnificent era in Indian history grew directly from the mind of a displaced refugee. He survived because he mastered the canon, and he built a lasting empire because